the axe in the forest in a quiet valley surrounded by towering mountains, where the mist lingered on treetops like whispers of old secrets, there lived a humble woodcutter named Edran. Every morning, before the first ray of sunlight touched the frozen dew, he rose from his straw bed, shouldered his worn axe, and walked into the forest. The villagers often said no man worked harder than Edran. His hands were calloused, his shoulders broad from years of labor, and his clothes were always stained with sawdust and sweat. From sunrise to sunset, the rhythmic sound of his axe echoed through the woods, a steady, unrelenting beat that became part of the valley's song. Edran believed that hard work was the only key to a better life. His father had taught him so, repeating those words like sacred scripture. "Work harder than anyone else," the old man used to say, "and you will never go hungry." Edran carried that lesson in his heart like a flame that refused to go out, even when the cold winds of struggle blew hardest. But despite his effort, life did not reward him equally. Day after day he cut trees, dragged logs, and sold firewood in the village square. Yet the coins he earned barely filled his pockets. His home remained a small wooden hut with cracks that let the winter in. The more he worked, the more tired he became, and the more he noticed how little changed. At first, he told himself that he simply needed to try harder. He extended his hours, rising earlier, sleeping later. When others rested, he worked. When others feasted, he saved. But no matter how fiercely he swung his axe, his pile of logs grew slower than his fatigue. Then one day a new woodcutter arrived in the valley. His name was Renn. He was younger, quieter, and less muscular than Edran. His axe looked strange, sharper, lighter, different. The villagers watched as Renn entered the same forest and returned by midday, with twice the amount of wood Edran brought after a full day's labor. Edran felt a sharp sting of disbelief. How could that be? He had spent his entire life perfecting his craft. He knew every sound the forest made, every knot in every trunk. And yet this newcomer, with fewer scars and a softer look in his eyes, was somehow cutting twice the wood in half the time. The villagers began to talk. Some said Renn must have found a secret path to easier trees. Others whispered that he was blessed by luck. But Edran refused to believe in luck. He believed in effort, raw, unending effort. And so he redoubled his work, determined to prove that no one could outwork him. Days turned into weeks. The air grew colder, the forest thinner, and Edran's strength began to falter. His hands trembled when he lifted his axe, his breath came in gasps, and his back burned with pain. Still, he refused to stop. Every swing was a battle against his own exhaustion, every drop of sweat a declaration of defiance. But despite all that, Renn's pile of logs kept growing faster. The villagers now bought from him instead of Edran. His wood was cleaner, smoother, and better cut. Slowly, Edran's customers dwindled. The pride he once carried began to crack under the weight of frustration. One evening, after a long day of cutting with little to show for it, Edran sat by the river that bordered the forest. His reflection in the water looked older than he remembered. His beard was grayer, his eyes heavier. He stared at his axe, its blade dull and worn, its handle splintered with use. For the first time, he wondered if sheer effort might not be enough, but the thought frightened him. To question that would be to question the very foundation of his life. What was left if hard work wasn't the answer? What else could there possibly be? The next morning, the sun rose pale over the mountains. Edran forced himself into the forest again. The mist was thicker that day, and the trees stood silent as if watching him. Each swing of his axe felt heavier than before, and each sound echoed longer, fading into the emptiness. He could no longer hear Renn's chopping in the distance, only his own. And then, for the first time, his axe head struck a knot and split in two. The blade cracked, snapping at the center. Edran dropped to his knees, staring at the broken metal in disbelief. It was more than just an axe. It was his companion, his identity, his pride. Without it, he felt naked and powerless. The forest around him seemed to close in. The silence was thick, almost accusing. His heart pounded, not from exertion this time, but from fear. For years he had measured his worth by how hard he worked. Now without his tool, what was he? He picked up the broken blade, running his thumb along its edge. It had grown dull long ago, he realized. Perhaps that was why the wood had felt harder lately, but he had been too focused on cutting to notice. He had never taken the time to sharpen it, thinking that every moment spent resting was a moment wasted. And now, His ignorance had caught up to him. That night, as the cold wind howled through the cracks in his cabin, Edran lay awake. He listened to the forest outside, the creaking of trees, the whisper of leaves, and he thought about all the years he had given to work that brought so little in return. He began to wonder if perhaps the problem wasn't the effort, but the way he had used it. He closed his eyes, a strange calm settling over him. The forest, the axe, the sound of his own breath, all blended into one quiet truth that he was only beginning to grasp. The next morning, he would return to the forest, not just to cut wood, but to find answers. For the first time in his life, Edran would stop swinging and start thinking. The pause that changes everything. The forest looked different the next morning. The air was sharp, still, and alive with a quiet that felt almost sacred. The mist clung to the trees like ghostly veils, and the light of dawn cut through it in golden threads. Edran stood at the edge of the woods, his broken axe hanging from his calloused hand. For the first time in years, he did not rush forward. He did not count the hours or measure the distance he must walk before the sun reached its peak. He simply stood there, breathing, watching. The forest that had always been his workplace now seemed like a teacher he had never truly listened to. He had always thought of the trees as obstacles, things to be conquered, cut, and carried. But now, in his stillness, he saw something else. Each tree grew at its own pace. None of them rushed. None of them forced growth through brute strength. They reached for the light patiently, layer by layer, ring by ring. Edran felt the truth settle deep in his chest. For years, he had been so focused on cutting that he had never stopped to learn how to cut better. He sat beneath a cedar tree and examined his axe. The blade was chipped, the handle loose. It had served him faithfully, but he had repaid it with neglect. Every swing had dulled its edge, and every day he ignored its wear, believing that effort alone would make up for it. He thought of Renn, the newcomer who somehow achieved more with less effort. Perhaps Renn wasn't stronger or luckier. Perhaps he was simply smarter. Perhaps he sharpened his axe. That thought stayed with him like a spark in dry wood. So Edran gathered his broken axe, carried it back to his hut, and began to repair it. He didn't know much about sharpening, but he remembered seeing his father do it long ago. The memory was faint. His father's hands moving rhythmically over a whetstone, sparks leaping in the firelight. Edran searched through his old belongings until he found a stone buried beneath a pile of forgotten tools. It was worn and dusty, but it would do. He lit a fire and began to grind the edge of his axe. The sound was sharp and steady, slicing through the quiet. It took hours. His hands ached. His patience thinned, but he kept going, each stroke bringing back the glint of steel that had long been hidden under years of dullness. When he finally held it up to the light, he saw his reflection in the blade, clear, sharp, and new. Something shifted inside him. It wasn't pride this time. It was understanding. That day, he didn't go back into the forest to cut. Instead, he spent hours observing the trees. He studied their roots, the angle of their trunks, the way the sunlight hit them. He watched how some trees fell easily when struck at the right spot, while others resisted no matter how many times they were hit. He realized that cutting wood wasn't just about force, it was about precision. He had been working like a blind man in a field of opportunity, striking wildly instead of wisely. When the next morning came, he set out early, not to prove his strength, but to test his new awareness. The forest greeted him like an old friend. The air smelled of pine and promise. He chose his first tree carefully, studying it before he lifted his axe. Then with a deep breath he swung once, twice, 3 times. The sound was different now. Clean, crisp. The blade sliced through the wood like water through sand. By midday, he had already cut more than he used to in an entire day. His arms felt strong, not from strain but from rhythm. He rested often, not out of fatigue, but to think. Each pause sharpened his mind as much as each stroke sharpened his blade. Edran began to notice other things he had missed before. The forest floor was filled with fallen branches, smaller pieces of wood that required no cutting at all. He had ignored them before, believing only the biggest trees were worth his effort. Now he gathered them, adding easily to his haul. Efficiency, not exhaustion, was the secret. In the days that followed, something remarkable began to happen. The villagers who had once passed him by started to notice his growing pile of wood again. It wasn't the largest yet, but it was clean, even, and well cut. his logs stacked neatly in rows, shining under the sun. He didn't rush to sell them. He took his time. He refined his process. When he finally brought them to market, his firewood burned longer and cleaner than anyone else's. People began to ask for his wood by name again. But this time, the success didn't swell his pride. It deepened his gratitude. He understood now that hard work was a foundation, not a finish line. Without learning, without reflection, effort alone could only take a man so far. As the days turned into weeks, Edran's rhythm transformed. Each morning he sharpened his axe before entering the forest. Each evening he spent a few moments reflecting on what had worked and what hadn't. The forest had become a mirror for his own growth. He began to notice patterns. The easiest trees to cut weren't always the best to sell. Some wood burned too fast, others too slow. He started categorizing them, learning which were worth his time. The work that once drained him now energized him. For the first time, Edran wasn't merely working. He was mastering. Still, he never forgot the lesson that had started it all, the day his axe broke, the moment his pride cracked. That memory became a compass, guiding him to humility and growth. But just as life began to balance, a new challenge appeared. One that would test not his strength or his skill, but his wisdom. One evening, as the orange sun sank behind the mountains, Edran noticed smoke rising from deeper within the forest. It wasn't from campfires or cooking. It was thicker, darker, alive with danger. A forest fire. Panic spread through the valley as villagers ran to save what they could. The flames devoured everything in their path, roaring louder than any storm. Years of trees, of memories, of effort, all turning to ash. Edran grabbed his axe and ran toward the flames, not away from them. The forest had given him everything, his living, his lessons, his life. He could not abandon it now. As he entered the burning woods, the heat hit him like a wall. Sparks flew through the air like angry fireflies. Trees he had once cut now crashed around him in chaos. He knew that no amount of strength could stop the fire. This would take something else, something he had only recently begun to understand. He tightened his grip on his axe and looked at the inferno before him, not with fear but with clarity. The time had come for his hardest lesson yet.